Well, hello, everybody. Pastor Joel here with you one more time for the past days with Pastor Joel. And of course, good news for all of you is you don't just have to see my face tonight. I've got a special guest with me, Jeff Vaughn. And I'm guessing some of you that watch my channel have maybe come across his name. And he co-authored a book, and it's right here called Beyond Creation Science. I think the original was in 2007, and it's co-authored with Tim Martin. And it just so happens that a lot of what I've been talking about as I've been working through Genesis a little bit, I'm right at the point where we're looking at the flood a little bit. And I did a general video on local versus global. But interestingly, there are some things that I had not come across that relate to the fulfilled view of eschatology. And of course, that's mainly what I cover on this channel. And so Jeff is going to help explain some of those connections for us, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. So first of all, Jeff, thank you for joining us.
You're quite welcome.
And tell us a little bit before we get into some of the particulars, maybe just a little thumbnail sketch. You know, who is Jeff Vaughn? How did you meet Jesus? How did you come to this crazy idea that prophecies are all fulfilled?
Well, I was raised in a Christian home, so I grew up in it.
Okay.
I was baptized in a Christian church, the instrumental side of the Churches of Christ Independent Christian Churches.
Okay.
And well, as for how I came into this whole study, one of the things that the high school group at our church and a bunch of the other churches in the area in Southern California did was once a month, we all gathered together and went to see one of the Christian concerts at Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa.
Oh, wow.
Back in the early middle 70s. And with that, there was always a monthly sermon. And that sermon was usually Chuck Smith, but one time there was also Hal Lindsey, a couple of times Henry Morris of ICR and the whole Young Earth Creationist bit, and Chuck Missler a couple of times back before he became famous, and a bunch of other people. And every single one of these sermons had an admonition to us high schoolers that we should not go to college because the rapture would occur before we graduated.
Wow.
And then it had an admonition that we should not get married because our infant children would be left behind in the rapture, and we should not develop a career because it was a waste of time. So, and especially with Henry Morris being one of the crowd, I could see the connection between young earth creationism and dispensationalism, and left me thinking I had a decision to make. Do I do what these people tell me to do? Or do I go to college? Do I get married and such? And in 1980, I was raptured right on schedule, or graduated right on schedule. Married my wife and my college sweetheart, and we ended up having 5 kids and bought a couple of houses along the way and working. And in 1986 or 87, 1987, I think it was. A friend invited me to go listen to old Earth creationist Hugh Ross.
Okay.
Listen to him, and his spiel made a little bit of sense, but except that it was still bound up in dispensationalism, and that was falling apart. In 92, a friend of mine said, "You need to read this book," and gave me Marcellus Kick's book. And I read that, and I've been a preterist ever since. I would say from the reading of that book in August of 72 until sometime around 2000, since I had never run into another preterist. And now, knowing what I do know now and looking back, I was some sort of not well-defined preterist idealist.
Okay.
Um,
Now, Jeff, just a quick interjection there. So, and I'm familiar with, with the Calvary Chapel movement and Chuck Smith. Would that have been the sermons you were hearing? Was that like early 70s, mid 70s, somewhere in there?
74 and 75.
Okay. And I'm also curious, you mentioned that you saw a connection between young Earth creationism and dispensationalism. Can you elucidate that just a little bit?
Well, Henry Morris was one of the sermonizers, giving that same. So he'd come and tell us about young Earth creationism, and then he'd end it with that same admonition that the rapture is going to happen.
Okay.
And it was pretty clear they're interpreting things the same way on both ends of the Bible.
Okay.
So it ended up being a problem. How do you, since it's pretty clear the rapture cult is wrong, because 1980 came and went, and people I've known who are younger than me, who've gone to Calvary Chapel, heard the same line. They were also told not to go. And so they were never repentant, obviously, of that false teaching that they were giving. They just changed the date.
Yeah.
So in 89, my wife had cancer, and she was pregnant with our 5th child at the same time.
Wow.
And the church, it was a Christian church again, and they had adopted a third Baptist heresy, the church growth movement, and they were wanting a happy church. And because my wife had cancer and she wasn't going to go through any treatment that would jeopardize the baby, we weren't happy.
Right.
We spent literally a year, given all the things involved, not knowing what was going on.
Wow.
No diagnosis.
Wow.
My wife literally found out she was pregnant for the first time from blood tests for her second cancer surgery.
Wow.
And so no more treatment after that until the baby's born and my wife healed from her C-section.
Wow.
And yes, she was told to abort and all that other stuff. And no, she wasn't going to do that.
Hmm.
But we weren't happy, and they literally told us, we want a happy church, and separately, not at the same time. So being a little slow about such things, took a little time to two and two together, but we want a happy church. They actually quit having corporate prayer for the needs of the people in the church and such. And so we left, and it turned out the next Christian church we went to, after we'd been there for about a year, one of the elders came up to me and asked, "What kind of preterist are you? A partial preterist or a full preterist?"
Mm.
And I responded there that I was not very partial to halfway measures, but what was a full preterist? And he gave me a couple of books, and I could say within a couple of days that I was definitely a full preterist and have been ever since.
Wow. Wow. So remind me of when that was.
Actually, I guess there was another church in there in between. I've got a little bit of confusion here. Okay, the cancer was in '89.
Okay.
92, I read Kick's book, and that was when I was at the next church, and we got run off from that church for asking questions.
Hmm.
So we've been ran off from one because we're it hasn't bothered me much, because once you run off because your wife had the audacity to have cancer and pregnant at the same time, it's what can these other people do to you?
Right.
But so it was a 2000 that I learned about full preterism.
Okay. So tell me a little bit. So your first edition of the book came out in 2007, I believe. So
that's the third edition.
Oh, that's the third edition. When was the first edition?
2001.
2001. So tell me a little bit about how did you meet Tim Martin, and how did you guys decide to write the book?
Well, Tim Martin had got himself in trouble with his church, a independent Presbyterian church of sorts, and by their way of doing things, you have to have 3 elders, and they had 2 old men, and these 2 old men picked him to be the 3rd elder.
Okay.
Not something you should be subjecting a kid to, but that's the way it was. Tim then quickly got himself in trouble because the other 2 elders decided they wanted to have ICR, Henry Morris's organization, come and visit.
Okay.
And they had an agreement that no, everything had to be unanimous between the 3 elders.
Right.
And he stood firm against it. And so they decided to start heresy proceedings against him.
Oh my.
So Tim wrote a 48-page pamphlet 48-page pamphlet that showed that any form of preterism basically required a local flood. Partial preterism, it doesn't matter what kind. If you think half of Matthew 24 is fulfilled, and it doesn't really matter which half, then the flood must be local. And one of the other elders was a partial preterist, and one was a full preterist. And in the meantime, I don't remember Answers in Genesis or ICR came to a local church and did a presentation, and Tim's complaints about it being Baptist, at least, were seen by the elder who went, and he decided that Tim had been correct, even if he disagreed about the extent of the flood. But Tim passed that book around in preterist circles, and I met him online as a result of that book. The second edition, I put in quite a bit of work in it, and he then decided to, in 2005, and he decided to send out copies of that book to a bunch of old Earth creationists and such, and theistic evolutionists and gap theorists, try and pique their interest. And two of them wrote back. Well, Tim took their letters and sent me copies and said, "What do we do about this?" And this was, I received those copies in the mail in the middle of November of 2005, and read them over, and I put together the outline for the third edition. The second edition was about 80 pages, a booklet. I put together the outline. I wrote a couple of the chapters, and by the middle of the first week of December, I had written a couple more chapters that needed to be added to it, and told Tim, but I still have no idea what to do about Genesis 1.
Okay.
And he looked that over, and he agreed that in the same spot. He liked my outline, and we started to work on the book for real.
Wow. So the 2007 edition, the third edition, that's sort of the first one that was the full edition with all of your input and Tim's input. Is that right?
Yes, and that's the one where we attempted to introduce covenant creation, which we still hadn't worked out, and a lot of people read it and still miss it completely. Covenant creation, but they can't miss a local flood. Okay.
So I want to get a little bit to both of those things, but I just want to mention, just to anybody listening, I have read Beyond Creation Science. I think I read it maybe 3-4 years ago somewhere, and I've referenced, use it as reference since then. But I think, just my opinion from reading it, regardless of where people end up with full orbed covenant creation, that just the beginning present, and I don't remember the order exactly, but I think it's early on in the book, which is basically just introducing full preterism, and that in itself is very, very strong and helpful. And then I also learned a ton about I knew a little bit about the history of dispensationalism and how that came in, but how there was kind of a reaction to that, and fundamentalism in churches, and I guess what I'm saying is I would encourage everybody to read it, because there's so much in the book in general, really well sourced, and a lot of good information, even with people don't buy all of covenant creation. Have you heard comments like that, Jeff? Does that seem fair?
I usually hear from people who claim to have read it but can't quote anything.
Okay. Okay.
So, and very few of them will acknowledge that chapters 1 through 4 is of any value, which is full preterism, is of any value.
Wow, because I thought that was, you got one anyway that thought that was very valuable to me. So thank you for that. Why don't you? Oh, go ahead.
People who do read it have come back and told us that chapters 1 through 4 is the best introduction to preterism that they've ever seen.
It's really good, for sure. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about, and I know it's a big topic, but I think I heard you say that a lot of people misunderstand covenant creation. Is that right? Did you say that?
Yes.
So what can you tell us? And I know this is hard to do in just a short presentation, but what is covenant creation, and what are one or two things that people misunderstand the most about it?
Well, first and foremost, any of the modern views of physical creation, those depend on the belief that the earth of Scripture is planet Earth. And that is a new, very new thought. Kepler named planet Earth in the first decade of the 1600s, at the time that the King James Bible was being translated.
Okay.
So no one would have thought of planet Earth with the word Earth. And as geology was being developed in the late 1700s and 1800s, and the impetus for geology being the flood, and the flood that people see in Genesis 1-2, people were starting to think in terms of the Earth being planet Earth, but no one actually said it until Thomas Chalmers in 1814 put it in print. And Thomas Chalmers is famous for the gap theory. The young Earth creationists scream and holler about Thomas Chalmers and how bad he supposedly is, and yet he is ultimately a major source of their doctrine, that the earth of Scripture is planet Earth.
So before that time, help explain that a little bit more. Before that time, what did people think?
Well, if you go and read the Old Baptist Confession or the Westminster Confession, and you read them all the way through, you'll see that they had some form of physical creation in mind, and separately some form of covenant creation in mind. And they held these two parallel, and no one in history ever discussed the two at the same time.
Okay.
When I was growing up, I would hear a little bit about covenant creation, and but young Earth creationism won't allow any form of covenant creation. And if you look at what people actually believed in history from the 1200s to around 1800, it was a mix of some sort of covenant creation that's not well defined, and some sort of local creation that's not well defined. And there's lots of stuff that discusses properties as local creation, and there are lots of stuff that not as much, but a lot, that this covenant creation, but never the two at the same time. Ward Finley and Mike Sullivan, to their credit, actually tried to put the two together.
Okay.
And I was still telling Tim that I don't think we'll ever know what Genesis 1 is about. When we went to see the two of them at a conference in Page, Arizona in August or the end of July, I don't remember which, in 2006. And there they were talking about this mixed model of a physical creation and a covenant creation, just what the Westminster Divines and the Old Baptist Church required. And they put in a lot of work on it, and Tim and I could see it didn't work. But that got me thinking to just throw out the physical creation completely and focus on covenant, which was an instantly solved the problems with full preterism, because we, the church, are the new heaven and the new earth. We are the new creation. And the old things, the old creation, the first heaven and the first earth has passed away, and there's no more sea. All things have become new.
Now, for people who, and I'm going to ask this question, I'm purposely asking it really, really simply, for those maybe who have no context, have never even maybe heard of covenant creation. What is the difference between, I guess, what we might call a traditional physical creation and covenant creation?
Well, first and foremost, in a physical creation, heaven and earth is assumed to refer to the physical universe and planet Earth. Or for the flat earthers who are physical creationists, the worldwide earth, whatever they want to call it.
Okay.
I'm going to lump them all together, and they will hate it, and they'll hate me for it, but that they are all physical creationists, and this is totally different.
Okay.
Back 3 or 4 weeks ago, I asked Pastor Steve McGowan what his tribe's creation story was.
Okay.
And he wrote out something that posted on Facebook. And then he said, I'd never thought of this. It's a covenant creation, my people, his people, their story. It didn't include all mankind, but it was written in the same sorts of terms and words and expressions that Genesis 1 is. And he knew it was his people's creation. And then I asked him, okay, well, what do you call the men of your tribe? And he gave a word. He gave a couple of words for that. And then I asked him, okay, and what do you call the foreigners? And he wrote down something that I can't pronounce, that he said translates to animals of the South. Men who are not of his tribe are. And so, then I pushed him a little further and said, okay, wait a minute. What about the nearby tribes that your tribe was allowed to trade wives with? Oh, those are the clean animals. So, and the animals of the South are the unclean animals who they're not allowed to trade for wives with in his tribal situation. Now, you and me, we lost our tribal roots around the time the first missionaries came to where our ancestors lived, in my case, Wales and Scotland. And so we don't remember our tribal stories.
Yeah.
In Steve's case, he's got tribal elders who are a generation or maybe even two older than him who remember these stories and remember when these stories were law. And so he's got an insight. We just can't understand the situation. And basically primitive tribal people that we rarely have any contact with, missionaries we know have contact with them, are the only ones who remember the old pre-Christian ways and how that government works, how they express things. And it's a lot like Genesis 1.
So just to be sure I'm saying this correctly, so if people look behind me, I've got, this particular green screen picture is this idea of maybe some kind of a physical creation or the cosmos. But with covenant creation, rather than Genesis being a story of origins about the creation of the physical material universe, it's a creation of it's covenantal creation. Is that the same thing as, because preterists would understand pretty well the difference between the two main covenants, the old covenant and the new covenant, but probably most would start that old covenant, with Sinai, the law being given and all that. And so is the covenant creation view that actually what most preterists think of the old covenant, actually that's what was started in Genesis?
Yes, Abel was the first martyr of the old covenant.
Okay.
We see Abel mentioned amongst the martyrs in Matthew 23.
Yeah.
We see Abel mentioned as one of faith in the Pharisees are called the brood of serpents and sons of their father Cain. It goes all the way back to that covenant. Eve was told that her seed would crush the head of the serpent. So, as Don Preston used to say before covenant creation came along, you can't have a covenant end until all promises of that covenant have been fulfilled. So that covenant that Adam was in could not be fulfilled until that prophecy was fulfilled.
Okay.
So historically, we've had people claiming there were 7 old covenants, and they pick 7 out of a list of 8. Nobody wants to admit that there's 8, so they pick 7 out of a list of 8, and they take turns of deciding which one they're going to drop. But what you end up having with that is Israel was under all eight of these 7 covenants. And that's just utter confusion. A man can only serve 2 masters. I've heard preachers jokingly say that that's why a man can only have one wife. Well, it's got to hold for covenants also.
So in that view, and again, I'm thinking of people maybe that haven't been exposed at all.
Mm-hmm.
If what a lot of people, preterists, but even outside of preterism, what a lot of people would see as the old covenant, again, starting at Sinai, if actually Genesis is speaking of that, then from the covenant creation view, what was it that happened at Sinai? What was given there? Does that make sense, the question?
Yes. My belief is that the law was given in a written form to a people where and made more formal. We have people talk about the law, well, and claim that the law wasn't given until Moses in Genesis 21 and following. But then we have to ask, what law was Moses judging with? What law was Moses teaching in Genesis 18? And Genesis says that Adam kept all of the law and all of the commandments. We have other pieces where how did Cain know that murder was wrong? How did Cain and Abel know what to sacrifice, how to sacrifice? How did Noah know which animals were clean?
Sure.
How did Joshua? How did Joshua know about the Levirate marriage laws before they were given? No, they were given in Genesis 1 at the time of Adam. We see in Colossians 1:16 that Paul gives an example of all things created.
Right.
And if you look at that example, it's the trappings of government. What do you need a government with numerous officials? He gives 4 classes of officials. A government with 4 levels of human officials. How does that work when you only have one man?
What's that scripture reference again?
Colossians 1:16.
Okay.
Young Earth creationists like to quote it and skip, just quote the first half and leave it there. Or even if they quote the whole thing, they ignore the second half and the details of it.
Yeah.
But Paul was saying that Jesus was present at the beginning when a government was created.
So I know you said earlier when we were just getting started a little bit that a lot of people just really misunderstand it. So is there one thing in particular, maybe one or two things that aren't pushbacks necessarily, because a pushback, I'm going to assume the person does understand it and doesn't agree. But let's start with just what are people missing? What do they not understand?
It's not really clear to me how and why they're misunderstanding. It's they outright reject it without thinking about it, and some people will say, you have to have a physical creation for them to use a metaphor. But if heaven and earth didn't mean the physical universe and planet Earth before 1814 to anybody, then it's not a metaphor to say it's covenant. If you go and look at other cultures that were in the area of where Abraham lived in Ur, including Ur itself, you'll see that heaven and earth was referred to the domain of a god. And God had to create his own domain. And these were tribal gods generally. And what did a tribal god do? Well, he had to have a people and a city and a set of laws. And that was his domain that he ruled over. And then they'd build a temple, and that temple would also be called heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And this was common all through the ancient Near East, from the beginning of writing to that expression was common from the beginning of writing until sometime around the time of David and Solomon.
Okay.
Nebuchadnezzar, by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, it was no longer being used for temples, as far as we can tell, but it was still used for a king's domain, including Nebuchadnezzar's domain. His domain was heaven and earth.
Yeah.
It was not the whole planet. It was not the sky. He was, though a human being, he was the God of heaven and earth.
Right. So people who hold the covenant creation, and again, I'm oversimplifying this on purpose a little bit. It's not so you tell me if this is correct. You're not saying, or people that hold to this view, that God wasn't involved somehow in the physical creation, but you're just saying that whatever he did or however he created it, that's not what Genesis is about.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely correct. So whether physical creation was the day before or the week before Genesis 1 or 14 billion years before Genesis 1, it's irrelevant to the meaning of Genesis 1.
Okay. Because I think I think that might be, it is some of what I've come across. What is confusing for people, maybe because they'll say, well, they're all kind. Or you could even go out, outside of Genesis and see, or maybe Job or Psalms or different things. And I think one of the misunderstandings might be that people are assuming that covenant creation almost ignores the physical creation or ignores God's role in it. But so I'm trying to clear that up for people and say, no, that's not it's not the case the way I understand it, but it's just that's not what that text is about. So that helps. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that.
Basically, the word earth all by itself in every language before Kepler used this named planet Earth. It appears its basic meaning is a land, a country, or the people of that land or country.
And that's the Hebrew term eretz. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it really should be land, but often is interpreted as earth.
It's translated frequently as earth, and because us moderns do not use earth to mean anything but the planet.
Yes.
We're aware of that other definition, but we don't use it for that.
Okay. Well, let's move a little bit to the flood, because I do want to touch on that. And again, and actually it was your book, I think, that when I read your book, I was a fairly new preterist, so I had so many things swimming around in my head all at the same time. But I would have never made the connection that from your point of view, and I think Tim's point of view, is that to be consistent as a preterist, it's really, is it too strong if I say from your viewpoint, to be consistent, it's necessary to believe in a local flood, or is that fair?
It's necessary for
Okay, so
partial
explain.
or full preterists.
Okay, so let's say you and I just I ran into you and I was talking to you, and you just said, hey, Joel, just so you know, to be a consistent full preterist, you have to believe in a local flood. And I say, why? How would you respond?
We have a frequent comparison between the second coming, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the flood. And which is the bigger judgment? The second coming is the bigger judgment.
So you're thinking
was
just
that a judgment on all humankind? No.
And just to interject quickly, so those would be like a couple texts that come to mind. Matthew 24, the flood comes up. 2 Peter 3. What would be some other, maybe a couple other references?
There's a couple other places where Jesus mentions the flood in Matthew, and also in the other versions of the Olivet Discourse, Mark or Luke 1, the other.
Okay.
It's not a common theme, but it's mentioned. Yeah. It's mentioned, I believe, 5 times.
Okay.
And this is the greater judgment. In addition, the flood and the destruction of Jerusalem are compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Matthew 24. I've never heard of anybody suggesting that was a global flood. A global judgment.
Right.
It was a substantial portion of the Jordan Dead Sea Valley. And all that Lot had to do was walk away, just as the people were told that when they saw the abomination of desolation in the holy place, all they had to do was walk away, but they had to hurry.
Right.
And it's not a global destruction if you can walk away from it.
Right. So in those texts where there is a comparison in some way between prophecy and the flood, as preterists, if we understand that judgment, the end times, is not the end of the world, but the end of that covenant, then it would be, from your view, it would be kind of a category mistake of the authors to compare this local judgment to a global flood. Am I understanding that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And once you get that through your head and thought on a bit, you then start saying, wait a minute, what about all these other words that sound like they are worldwide?
Right.
In the New Testament and the Old. And you start looking how they're used. And from the point of view of the King James authors, in King James English in that culture, it's actually a much better translation than we think. The words have changed meaning, and the Bibles have kept the old words with the new meanings.
Okay.
And once young Earth creationism came into the fore in the 1960s, it didn't exist outside of the Seventh-day Adventist Church before that. Once it came into being in the greater church, the translations started changing to be even more insistent on worldwide.
Why do you think that was?
Because the people who are buying Bibles, Answers in Genesis, and it used to be ICR, Institute for Creation Research, but now Answers in Genesis. They have a big market, and if they tell the world that something is bad, there's 60 million Christians who listen to them.
Yeah.
Um,
what? Oh, go ahead.
Most publishers will not accept a book that most Christian publishers will not accept a book that goes against what Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis says.
Yeah. So what are you talked about just misunderstandings for probably a variety of reasons with covenant creation. For those who do understand what you're claiming, what are some of the main pushbacks? Why don't people like it?
They deny that Adam had a covenant mainly, which I am straight from young earth creationism.
Okay. Why is that a problem for young earth creationists particularly?
Well, it isn't for the Seventh-day Adventist ones. So it's part of their dispensationalism. They want to, just like they break up the church history into 7 ages, they want to break up the pre-church history into 7 ages.
Right.
And so that's what it comes down to. And so we've got people who swear that there was no covenant before Sinai, and they will point to Deuteronomy 5 for that, which is pretty silly in my opinion. Deuteronomy 5 basically has God saying, I didn't make this covenant with your fathers. I made it with you at Sinai or Horeb. Okay, but this is after the generation that was at Horeb was dead. So he made a covenant at Horeb with people who weren't even born yet. Or the oldest ones at least had no legal standing to enter into a covenant. They're too young. So it's certainly a bad argument. And then you have the ones who claim that, no, the covenant started with Abraham. Well, Isaiah 51 is a popular one passage for them to point to. But Isaiah 51 mentions the Eden. It mentions the garden in Eden. It mentions a couple of different things in Genesis 1, and that's all part of these people who are in Abraham, part of their history, not your history and mine, their history, or at least not directly our history. It's only our adopted history.
Right. On page, I thought this was a really succinct statement. This is page 137 from the book Beyond Creation Science. It says, could it be that the Bible references both the flood and what happened in Judea in the first century as great covenant judgments in covenant history? And you've already kind of explained it, but even as succinct as you can, what do you mean by that statement?
The flood, the purpose of the flood was a covenant judgment on the people called Adam.
Okay.
It was not on mankind in general. It was the
Okay.
people called Adam, the people who lived on the face of the earth.
Okay.
Cain had been driven from the face of the earth. He lived someplace else. Where Cain was, no flood.
Okay.
Cain had a separate genealogy. So he was not part of Adam's genealogy in Genesis 5.
Right. Right.
So we have this separate genealogy for Adam that's different from Cain, and it's Adam that was judged. Adam of the genealogy, not mankind.
And as you read it, and we already talked about one term that's often translated earth that really might be better rendered land. Is that the same thing with some of the other terms? If somebody is reading through the flood narrative, at first reading, it certainly seems like something that's more catastrophic. But then when you start understanding what the words really meant, is that where the change happens?
Well, you have the translators and the commentators tell us that Adam means man.
Yeah.
And so they translate Adam as man numerous times. There are two other words in Hebrew that translated man, Enosh and Ish. Now, Ish is sometimes translated or meant as husband. But when it's not husband, it's man or mankind. Interesting that we have at the end of Genesis 4, Seth names his son Enosh in honor of the men called Enosh that are coming to the Lord. And every place in Scripture where we have either Ish or Adam, and either Ish or Enosh, one of those two, and the word Adam in the same verse, usually have a comparison. God is not an Ish that he should lie. Okay, men lie. Nor a son of Adam that he should repent. Who should be doing the repenting? Those in covenant with God. Those who don't know God have no reason to repent. So there's a subtle but definite covenantal tie-in for Adam in that passage. It's not there for man in general, Ish in general. Now, Ish and Enosh, the way Hebrew works, those could be just alternative spellings of the same word. And we have no case of both of them used in the same verse as far as I know.
Okay.
Or even the same passage. In the tribes that spoke a similar language to Hebrew, to ancient Hebrew, like in ancient Akkadian and ancient Ugaritic, Enosh might have been the prefix en in front of Ish, and it's in that form in Akkadian. It referred to people with, well, not really necessarily kings, but royalty, general royalty and such. So you're someone in the king's family, you'd be Enosh.
Okay.
And, um, but I don't know that that's what's going on in the case of the Hebrew. It could just be, in that first case, is Seth making these people out to be royalty because they accept Christ, or excuse me, because they accept God, and that could be part of Seth's thinking. But the other uses of Enosh in the Bible, I don't see any reason to believe that could be going on.
Okay.
It is used as if it's just an alternate spelling for Ish.
Okay. No, that's really helpful too. Well, Jeff, we begin winding down a bit here. Let's take it to get to, not that this isn't practical, because to me, all theology is, it all ends up having consequences and it's practical. But what I mean by practical is, I've engaged with you a handful of times on Facebook, and I'm kind of in and out depending on the seasons of life. But you and I have both seen preterists sometimes not be very nice to each other. Sometimes it's covenant creation versus physical creation. A lot of times it's the IBV view during the corporate view. What do we do? How are the gifts active or not active? And one of the things I've appreciated about you, at least in things I've seen, is that you don't use ad hominem attacks and fire off of people. And some people do that, not just within preterism, but outside of that. But could you speak to that a little bit? What would you like to see when people are exploring covenant creation, or maybe they're looking into other things? How would you like to see people interact?
Well, first of all, most of the people who I see with the negative stuff about it have never read the book and refuse to read the book. And it just seems to me, if you know nothing about the topic, you should just shut up.
Fair enough.
If you're so uninterested in it, why are you bothering? If you call me a heretic because of this, wait a minute. You're already a heretic by the whole church's view because you have accepted preterism.
Right. I have found that very, very ironic. Right? People that are willing to entertain preterism and even stand up for that, then calling other preterists heretics is indeed a little odd.
Tim and I have been accused of trying to destroy Christianity. We've been, I don't know. I'm trying to understand Scripture. That's all. And in this work for the book, once I had a basic understanding of covenant creation after pulling apart what Ward Finley and Mike Sullivan said, and I owe them a great debt for that, even though Mike Sullivan doesn't accept covenant creation. It took Tim another 6 months. And in the meantime, we went through literally thousands of versions of physical creation, trying to work out. And nope. That's what it took before Tim was convinced that no, physical creation cannot work with preterism, period. Just cannot. We have a lot of questions that our opponents, our critics need to answer that they've never touched, they ignore. That first one that I mentioned, what about Abel? How come he's the first martyr of the Old Covenant if the Old Covenant didn't exist? Right. Every single one of our critics that I've asked that of has ignored it. Not a word, not a peep. Why is heaven and earth used in the description of the Old Covenant in Revelation?
Right.
And there's is there any reference to Moses in the entire book of Revelation or Abraham? I think I remember seeing one of Abraham. Every allusion is to things in Genesis.
Yeah.
John wanted you to think of Genesis and the undoing of what happened in Genesis when you read Revelation.
Yeah.
All the way down to we are partakers of the tree of life in the city.
Right.
Which the city is the garden with a bigger wall, all grown up, as Tim likes to say. We have the problem of what was Adam's death, and we have Don Preston has worked a lot on that, showing that it's not physical death, but he really, because he doesn't want to touch covenant creation, he doesn't have a good answer. It's very simple. We are told in Isaiah 65:23 that in the new heavens and the new earth, God's people will no longer toil, and the women will no longer labor in childbearing. And the reason why? Because God's people, they and their descendants will be the seed of the blessed Lord. Seed, offspring, children. And then you put that together, wait a minute. We are now in the church. We are the seed of the blessed Lord. We are the children of God. We are joint heirs with Christ.
Right.
We have the spirit of adoption. The curse has been removed from us. So, but women still suffer from childbirth. And so you go back and look more carefully because of all this at 65:23, and you'll see, wait a minute, what's going on? It's the emotional and mental and toil that's caused by being a slave. God's people in the Old Covenant were slaves. They were servants. They were not heirs. They were not sons.
Right. Right.
And our wives, their wives were not raising sons. My wife raised sons and daughters of God. Their wives back then were raising servants.
Yeah.
The anguish of a woman knowing that her child is a servant. Can you imagine what it must have been like for the slaves in the South 150 years ago? They're not free. They are working for the master.
Right.
And in the Old Covenant, the Jews and the Hebrews were working for the master.
Right.
And they were raising more servants for the master.
Right. Well, there is so much here, and in some ways we just scratched the surface a little bit, I think, of some of this. But let me just again, for those who aren't aware, here's the book. Get it over here in the camera. Beyond Creation Science by Jeff Vaughn and Tim Martin. And it's also, I'm sure, I mean, I would encourage people to buy the book, but I know it's also available, I think, as a PDF online for free. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's
You
very
go to
generous.
our website, and it's also on a bunch of the different Facebook groups in their download section.
Okay. And
And we
again,
don't ask you to register or anything. You just download it directly.
All right. Awesome. And again, for those who haven't read it yet, I can definitely recommend it, even if you don't agree with all of the tenets of covenant creation, just for the presentation of preterism. And there's some great historical things as well. But Jeff, thanks so much, for coming on. And again, there's a lot more to talk about. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
You're most welcome anytime.
All right. So everybody, Pastor Joel saying bye for now.